Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Some people are signing on still, but we'll begin. Our special speaker tonight in our Tuesday night series is Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner, who is the Senior Rabbi and Director of the Spiritual Care Department at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, where he is responsible for the chaplaincy team and all aspects of spiritual care. Rabbi Weiner previously served as the assistant rabbi at Young Israel Century City. He has earned 2 rabbinic ordinations as well as a doctorate in clinical bioethics from Loyola University, where he also earned a master's in bioethics and health policy. In addition to his master's degree in Jewish history from Yeshiva University, he is a board certified chaplain through Neshama, the Association of Jewish Chaplains, where he also sits on the association's board. Rabbi Weiner is a member of the executive committee of the Cedars-Sinai Bioethics Committee. He is past president of the Southern California Board of Rabbis and has been honored with rabbinic leadership awards from the OU and Chai Lifeline. He is also the rabbi of the Knesset Israel Synagogue of Beverlywood, and he is a sought-after speaker, teacher throughout the country. He is the author of 2 books, Jewish Guide to Practical Medical Decision-Making and Guide to Observance of Jewish Law in a Hospital. I believe I own both. I meant to bring at least one down to show you, but I forgot to show it to you. And I'll just share before we begin, many of our speakers, I'll let everyone in on a secret, one of my secret goals of this series. So many of the speakers are people, teachers, rabbis, educators that I have personal relationships with or I'm familiar with. But we hope to expose members of the community to maybe people who you don't know and hear someone say, wow, that person was really interesting. Tonight is an example of someone who has been a wonderful opportunity for myself to get to know and connect a little bit better. I had read some of the things Rabbi Weiner had written, but I never really interacted with him directly. And so because of this, I'm getting to hear him directly, know him a little bit better. And we even had an issue that came up since we planned this, that we discussed something and he gave me some good advice based on his experience and knowledge. So I am particularly excited about the talk tonight. The title of the talk is New Complex and Inspiring Medical Ethics Dilemmas Raised by the COVID Pandemic. We will be recording the talk, as always. It'll be on the YouTube channel in a few days, and people should feel free to ask questions as Rabbi Weiner presents. So without further ado, Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Rabbi Hellman. I've been a big fan of the work that you're doing and of yours, and I know it goes without saying, but I know everyone in your community is very lucky to have such a wonderful Rav. I mean, you all know it already, but you have admirers from all over the country, and I'm one of them, so it's really, thank you for having me and keep up your incredible, great work. I've always wanted to go to Boston. I'm embarrassed to say that despite having lived in New York for 6 years, I've never been to Boston in my life. And I really want to go. I don't know if I'd want to go in January, but I would love to go there. So it's good to at least be there with you virtually and try to feel like I'm in Boston. Here in Los Angeles, it's a different kind of town than Boston. I don't know. I imagine Boston as being, very centered around universities and higher learning and intellectual, greatness. Los Angeles has different reputations. I'm sitting right now, actually, in my office here at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, right in the middle of LA. We're on the border of, if any of you know LA, on the border of West Hollywood, Los Angeles, and Beverly Hills. That's where we're located. The corner I'm on is literally the corner of George Burns Drive and Gracie Allen Road. It's a little bit of a theme here. It is Hollywood. The building next door to me is the Steven Spielberg building. There's the Streisand Pavilion. I'm in the Max Factor Tower. Our cafeteria is the Ray Charles Cafeteria. And that's just part of who we are here. And sometimes when I am virtually in another city, I kind of recognize the uniqueness, I guess, of Hollywood. It's funny, it does impact us. As a rabbi, I'm a rabbi in a hospital, and I know that not all hospitals have a rabbi. This is a Jewish hospital, very proudly Jewish hospital, a huge Magen David on the top and a mezuzah on every door. And, we have a kosher kitchen here in the building. And but being Hollywood, the hospital is very concerned about its image and how it portrays itself. And there's very specific brand standards that I sometimes don't get used to. So for example, 2 years ago now, before Pesach, we have a kosher kitchen. We have kosher LePesach food for all the patients. And we create a menu and we send it out to everyone. And I want them to be comfortable that the food is kosher and they can rely on it. So the food is under the rabbinical supervision of the RCC. In California, that's the Rabbinical Council of California. It's a very well, regarded kashrut certification organization. And I just wrote on the menu, I just wanted to make it clear that no one would have any questions. So I put on the bottom, all food under the strict rabbinic supervision of the RCC. And that was on our menu for Passover. What I didn't know is that the brand standards at our hospital, they changed the standards and they don't like acronyms anymore. They want everything spelled out all the way so that no one makes, any assumptions or mistakes. But they didn't check with me, what does RCC stand for? And they made an assumption. Well, what's our cafeteria called? So and I didn't even see it. So all of a sudden, they just start sending out our menus to all the patients, thousands of patients, hundreds of keeping kosher. Erev Pesach, it was a Pesach that was on a Friday, that was on a Shabbat, it was a Friday. And people start looking at their menu for the Passover meal. It says, all food under the strict rabbinic supervision of Ray Charles. You can imagine I got some angry phone calls and a lot of explaining to do. This has spent the whole afternoon, going to patients, calming them down. Don't worry, this is not a joke. It was a mistake. It's really kosher. Once I finally calmed them down, normally we have a Shabbat service right before Shabbat here. We broadcast it to the patients' rooms and we announce on the loudspeakers, Shabbat service will be in 10 minutes. But that week I felt like it's Shabbat, it's Passover. Let's just do the Seder. It's going to get too complicated doing a Shabbat service and a Seder. We'll just announce the Seder. So I had to call the PA system, the people that make their announcements, and say, could you please just cancel the announcement for the Shabbat service this week? And they said, yeah, no problem. So I'm getting ready to go home. Finally, everyone's calm for Passover. And the loudspeakers, this is a big hospital. There's, over 1,000 patients, 15,000 employees. So loudspeakers for like 20,000 people. Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? This week, Shabbat is canceled. Shabbat is canceled. Oh boy, I'm not getting home anytime soon. So it can be complicated, but we have our own challenges in every city, I guess. But that's nothing compared to the challenges we've faced this past year. But anyways, I'd love to go to Boston one day, and I'm sure I'll let you know if I'm in town. And hope I'll be able to be there. But it really has been quite a year, huh? This past year, and there's been a lot of challenges and lots of struggles and lots that we've learned. And I know throughout the country. Unfortunately, in Los Angeles, we really were the epicenter just in these past couple of weeks. But I know that everywhere has had their struggles at different times throughout this past year. And we've learned a lot, and we're beginning to reflect, even though we're still in the midst of the pandemic, and we're not saying that it's over yet by any means, but we are starting to also reflect a little bit. What have we learned and what have we experienced? And there's been some really profound and powerful and important lessons. And just this week in particular, the past couple of weeks, I'm really reflecting on a big challenge that we've had. And I know healthcare providers, teachers, first responders, clergy, long-term care facilities, living facilities, lots of places are starting to face these challenges, which is, challenges related to burnout, anxiety, self-care. It's been exhausting. We call it, pandemic fatigue. Now there's a lot of fatigue this past year. It has really been an exhausting year. It's hard to maintain these standards and to have all this worry and anxiety for a whole year. And for healthcare providers, especially who are worried about, getting their families sick or getting themselves getting sick or losing their jobs, there's a lot of struggle. And one of the questions we've been thinking about, first of all, we've had to find new ways of dealing with things, of coping. And it has brought a lot of creativity. I'm hopeful that, there's a lot that we're going to gain from this pandemic, as much as we've lost and as much how horrible it's been. Hopefully we've learned new things. So for example, here in the hospital, normally in this hospital, I don't know about that, most hospitals, it seems to be a little bit more controlled, but in our hospital, there's like 1,000 different entrances to get in. There's no one main entrance. But this past year, we've created, screening locations. So there's only 3 ways to get into the hospital. So we realized this is an opportunity. We can station chaplains at the entrances and the exits. and they can check in with people. We've done something where, you know, the staff, as they're coming into work, we do something called blessing of the hands. We're kind of just bless them and thank them for their hard work. Sometimes give them a little treat or something, you know, as they finish their shift, and just share our presence. And we've been amazed by how many people have actually stopped us and needed someone to talk to, and just kind of being there. We've created these little carts where we go around to the units and just bring these little break, give people a 5-minute break, something to like a snack, and they end up talking, and usually tears come flowing pretty quickly. Speaking of being in a hospital, you know, when I first started working here, it's been almost 15 years now. The previous rabbi, you know, I came from a synagogue from Young Israel of Century City. It was overwhelming being around so much death and sickness at first, and I was a little bit having a hard time coping myself. And I asked the previous rabbi, Rabbi Levi Meir of blessed memory, you know, how do you deal with so much death and suffering, being in a hospital environment all day? So I remember we were walking down the hall right here. He said to me, "Oh, come on, look around. This isn't a hospital. This is a art museum," which is true. This hospital is a bit of an art museum as well. But he was joking. But then he said to me, "You know, the real answer is," he said, he had a lot of great lines. He also he said to me at that point, he said, "You know, it's true that the people in this hospital's bodies are less well than the average person in society, but their souls, they're much more in touch with their soul. Their souls are much healthier. Where else can you walk into someone's room and say to them, you know, tell me about your day?" And within seconds they're crying and sharing their heart with you. There is an openness in the hospital, tenderness. He also used to say, and we've seen this year, one of his sayings was, the hospital is a place where the temporarily well care for the temporarily not well. And it's so true, you know, hopefully people are not well, it's temporary and they get better. And also those of us who are caring for them, you know, everyone goes through struggles and illness. But, you know, we've had to find these ways to try to care for the caregivers, care for patients. We've had wonderful people, you know, just the amount of chesed and kindness people have shown. We've had, for example, concert musicians who are basically out of work this year. You know, people in the arts, it's such a difficult year for them. You know, you don't have concerts and plays and performances. So we had a group who reached out to us from around the country, and they said to us, you know, we like to play concerts. We can't do that now. We want to offer our services. If you have any patients who are feeling isolated and lonely, which who isn't feeling isolated and lonely in this pandemic, especially in the hospital where there's no visitors allowed, contact us through this. We created a special website, and let them request what songs they want, and we'll play a live concert for them. You know, 15-minute, 20-minute concert based on their own requests, an orchestra, and it's really incredible. And you know, it's also just brought patients to tears, and it's been very meaningful. And we found how, you know, caring for families. You know, this is Rabbi Soloveitchik of blessed memory actually wrote about this. How part of the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim, you see from Avraham, when God visited Avraham and also cared for Lot. The same angels cared for Avraham and Lot, because visiting the sick is caring for the sick and caring for their family. That's part and parcel of the same mitzvah. If someone's sick, they're worried about their family. So we've been transforming what we do as chaplains. It's not just caring for the patient. Their family, who would normally be by their bedside, is now stuck. We had a woman whose husband was here. First, we had a man whose wife was here. He told me that it was his first time in 60 years of marriage not sleeping in the same bedroom as his wife. And he said to me, I remember, you know, I'm only 42 years old. And he said to me, "Rabbi, I don't know if you can understand, if you can relate to what I'm saying and how difficult this is for me." There was a woman whose husband was here. And so she slept in her car for a month. Down the road, we tried to convince her, you know, go home and shout. She couldn't bear to be here while her husband was in the hospital. She wanted to be with him, but the hospital has been very strict, you know, no visitors. And just to see the dedication, and then to focus our energy and trying to care for their families as well. It's been very profound and very challenging. And so it led to me to a conclusion that was kind of new for me, and I'll share it with you. It was kind of a new idea that I had. Most of what I'm going to share tonight is not really my own ideas, but interesting dilemmas that have arisen. But, you know, we're seeing a lot of burnout. I've spoken just last week, I spoke to a nurse who normally doesn't work with critically ill patients. She normally works kind of in rehab, but we've been so overwhelmed that nurses have had to, and doctors have had to do jobs that is not normally part of their expertise. And she told me she had never seen someone die before. She's working in a hospital for 15 years. She never saw death. And she said to me, on one shift, 2 out of 3 of her patients died. And this is just overwhelming for many people, to see so much suffering and death is very difficult. And the concerns about burnout, and the question becomes, what is the extent of our responsibility? We know that we have responsibility to care for others. It's part of, ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. It's part of lo tamod al dam reacha, love your neighbor as yourself. Don't stand idly by. It's part of our obligation as a Jew to care for other people. As a healthcare provider, it's part of the basic oath of duty. There's actually an interesting story that I recently read about the Steipler Gaon. That's Rav Chaim Kanievsky's father, the great rabbi in Bnei Brak, considered one of the greatest, Haredi rabbis of the previous generation, where someone wrote him a letter. The letter's published. They asked him, I have two choices. I'm a medical doctor and I'm a rabbi. I was offered a job as a medical doctor in a Jewish city where I can live with my family in a Jewish town, and I'll be a doctor. And that was an offer that I have. I was also given an offer as a rabbi in a small town. My kids won't have a Jewish community, won't have schools. It'll be a challenge. There's probably a lot of good that I could do there, but I won't have the same structure. What should I do? And the Steipler, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the mainstream approach, but this is just to show the extent. The Steipler Gaon responded, the obligation, the extent of obligations on doctors, according to halacha, is so much that you're expected to do so much for them, despite any costs or time that it takes you, that you're better off being the rabbi in a small town where, even though it's going to be hard on your family, you're more likely to be able to fulfill your obligations. If you're a doctor, the expectations are so high, he wrote. And so my question becomes then, well, is it ever justifiable to take a break, to take some time off, to care for oneself? How does halacha regard caring for oneself during difficult times, in particular pandemic? And the Shulchan Aruch says that in the Steipler quotes us that, if you can help someone and you don't help them, it's ke'ilu shofech damim. It's like shedding blood. So that's quite high standards, and that can lead to burnout. So here's what I wanted to share, just a perspective. And I got this from a conversation that I had with Rav Asher Weiss in Jerusalem, actually literally like about a month before the pandemic. I went to visit. I brought my son for a bracha to him before his bar mitzvah, and I asked him this question about myself. I just said, privately to him, I'm exhausted at such hard work in the hospital. I love what I do, but it's also exhausting. How far is my obligation? Because there's no limit to the amount of needs that there are. I could be here in the hospital 24/7 and not fulfill all the things that I could possibly do for the patients, right? There's just no limit for any of us, right? There's so much good that we could do if we had unlimited energy, but it's difficult. So he shared with me a perspective that I want to develop. There is one perspective that, for example, the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, says in Choshen Mishpat that a person cannot take upon another job. If they have a job, they cannot take upon another job if they will thereby do their main job less well. If they can't do as good of a job on their, I'm using the same word too much, they won't be able to do their primary work as effectively. And there is a perspective that, the Shulchan Aruch also says, then if you then make mistakes because you're exhausted, you'll be liable for those mistakes. So you have to be careful how far you extend yourself. But the perspective that Rav Asher Weiss shared with me and kind of hinted at, and then I looked up more in his writings and the writings of Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Avadia Yosef. Actually, I have a picture of both of them together right here in my office. I forget about that sometimes, but that Rabbi Hellman pointed it out to me. I just love that picture because you have the great Sephardic and the great Ashkenaz together. That's why I have Soloveitchik with the Lubavitch Rebbe together. And unity. I just love that. So anyways, they wrote about how, that there's a commandment to give meiser, to give, a tenth of one's possessions. Really, obviously in Israel with their crops, but also is customary with tzedakah to give a tenth. So the Talmud argues that, there is a limit, Talmud. As on the one hand, you're supposed to give a tenth, but you shouldn't give more than a chomesh, more than a fifth of your possessions, because we don't want, giving tzedakah, helping others, to impoverish us, and then others will have to help us. Like, you should have to be able to, maintain a basic standard of living, and so there's a limit on how much we should give. So the rabbis argued that if you can't give more than a fifth of your money, you also shouldn't give more than a 1/5 of your body, meaning of your well-being, because you shouldn't be that your money is more valuable than your emotional, physical well-being. And if you're not able to literally, if you're going to get sick from giving so much of yourself, then you can only give up to a fifth, and you shouldn't give more than a fifth of yourself. The challenge is, well, how do we quantify that? What does that mean? So here's my argument, and this is what, and I've been trying to actually argue this. I've been telling staff this, and I've been telling HR, and I've been counseling people. Literally, I think this is a halachic requirement. This is my own. Okay, I'm not going to argue now that this is the official halacha, but this is what I'm convinced of right now, and I'm open to being pushed back, to push back. But if we're going to argue that you can't give more than 20% of yourself, to others, you have to care for yourself. So let's say, for example, it's one thing you have a very busy week. We all have busy weeks, busy days, busy months. But this pandemic, it's been a year, almost a year now. So let's say one normally works 50 hours a week. So 20% of that is 10, right? So then my argument is a person should not work on average more than 60 hours a week during the pandemic. They should say, I have to have a limit. I'm not working more than 60 hours a week. 50 hours is my norm. I'm willing to go up to 60, but not past that. That's too much. That's too much above and beyond what I can handle. Or let's say vacation. Let's say they normally say I take 14 vacation days a year. It's a pandemic. I need to be there. But my argument is don't decrease it by more than 20%. Still take at least 11 days off that year. You need time off. It's important. It's essential. And I think it's a halachic requirement. And it's not always possible. At our hospital right now, and I don't know if this has been done elsewhere, we have been so overwhelmed that the entire month of January and February, no one's allowed to take a day off. We actually are not allowed a single day off because we have become so stretched thin. Obviously, if someone's sick or something, they're sick, but so that could happen. But this is my argument when it comes to care for oneself through this pandemic, to make sure they don't overdo it in terms of how many hours and they work, and make sure that they are still taking breaks. There's a lot to say about that, and it can go a lot of ways. But before I now move on to the next kind of area that we've learned about during the pandemic, I'd love, and just if there's any comments or questions about that, I'm happy to hear what you think.
People should feel free. Maybe this, either directly on point or something related to life in the hospital, related to the halachic ideas, right? Weiner shared. Okay, well, we'll hear about a few different areas, a few different issues.
No obligation.
So why you continue?
Okay, so there's been a couple of other very interesting issues that arose that are really important reminders, because when it comes to both bioethics and halacha, the importance of researching and studying what's come up in this pandemic is not just like, oh, it's so interesting to see like what the rabbis have said and the bioethicists have said, and we should put these on our bookshelves because the next pandemic, hopefully in much more than 100 years, we're going to want to research and see what happened. Just like in this pandemic, we've looked back at Rabbi Akiva Eger, for example, during the cholera epidemic, and kind of seen how people dealt with it then, and that could be instructive. But I actually think it's much deeper than that. I think analyzing how rabbis and bioethicists and others have responded to the pandemic helps us get down to first principles, meaning recognizing what is the essential. During normal life, there's many things that we do and we like to do, and sometimes they're very good. Sometimes they're what we call, lifnim mishura sadin, they're above and beyond, or there's different reasons why we do things, different customs. But when it comes to the pandemic, we've really had to figure out what's the exact requirement, what can I change, what can't I change no matter what, and really try to figure out like what are the red lines, what are the parameters, and understand the nuts and bolts of halachic reasoning, of ethics, and this has forced us to do that in some profound ways. So one example, when it has come to rationing and distribution of both the vaccine that we're in the midst of figuring out right now, and ventilators and oxygen, right, which we've had to deal with throughout the pandemic, and especially at the beginning, but again recently here. It's fascinating that the halachic approach has been identical with the bioethics approach that has been adopted in the United States, but maybe for different reasons. And I'll just explain the reason, because it just gets to a very important, crucial principle, and then it leads to another interesting principle. And that principle, we call it in American healthcare, we call it population health. And population health means, how do I care for the most people possible, right? It's some kind of a triage issue. So what it might mean, for example, is that let's say you have 3 categories of sick people. The sick, normally you walk into an emergency room and you have a triage nurse there, and the sickest person who's like on the verge of death, they're going to get prioritized first. The medium person is going to get next priority, and the person who's basically healthy is going to have to wait maybe a few hours. But that's not been the approach during the pandemic. The approach becomes very different. That middle category ends up becoming prioritized, because if someone's very, very sick and not likely to survive, or they're going to need lots of intensive care resources or lots of staffing resources, it might be that it makes more sense to save more lives and not use all those resources to maybe not even save that one life. And so the middle category ends up getting more priority. And that might mean for a ventilator, it might mean for a vaccine. I'll give you an example. It's opposite for the two. So when it came to the ventilators, for example, that often meant it's one thing if someone's already on a ventilator. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about removing ventilators here. I'm just talking about who do you give it to if you have a choice. You have one ventilator and 3 patients, and you have to decide. So when it comes to that, oftentimes the choice will be both halachically and in American bioethics for the most part. I'll share some exceptions in a minute. You'll likely give it to the person who has the better chance of survival. So that might favor someone who's younger and healthier for the ventilator, because they'll likely need the ventilator for shorter, and then it can be given to another patient who will then need it, hopefully for not too long. So that might prioritize the younger, healthier people. But when it comes to the vaccine, on the other hand, since younger and healthier people are more likely to survive a COVID infection, so the vaccine is therefore, since limited dosages of the vaccine are therefore going to be shared with the people who need it the most, and therefore the older and people with the more comorbidities, the more people more at risk, are prioritized for the vaccine. Because the goal is, how do we help the most people? And so it's the opposite sometimes when it comes to, for example, ventilators and vaccines. Would you get this in halacha? So it's fascinating, because this is the approach that the rabbis take. There's 2 primary sources that are really, really interesting. One is a Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says, what if a house is on fire, God forbid, and you need to run in first? It has like triage questions. What do you do if there is, God forbid, a dead body and a Sefer Torah? Which do you save? So the Mishnah Berurah says, save the dead body. Kavod Abrias, Kavod Ames, you save the person and try to remove them from the fire. And you have to, unfortunately, let the Torah burn. What if, this case, it says, what if you have someone who's already very dangerously ill? They're already impacted by the fire. And someone else who is not at all impacted by the fire. But you have equal chance of getting both. Equal chance of saving. So the Mishnah Berurah says, save the one who's not yet impacted. They have a better chance of survival, and therefore you save them. Another source, and this is fascinating because it's become so relevant. I don't know if anyone ever predicted this would become so relevant. Have you ever heard of trolleyology? Trolleyology is a philosophical debate over the following question. Train is coming down the tracks, barreling down the tracks. There's a fork in the tracks. You're at the fork. There's a lever there. You could pull the train to your left side or just let it go. And you're just watching the train come down the tracks, and you look, and on the track that it's already on, down track, there's a family of 6 having a picnic, and they happen to take a little nap, and they're very deep sleepers. They don't hear the train coming. They're going to get killed by this train. And you think, oh, how sad. Oh, but I have the chance to save their lives. I'll just pull this lever. And then you look, and on that track where you're going to divert the train, there's one person taking a nap. And you think, oh boy, my action will kill that person. If I do nothing, I'm not doing anything, but 6 will die. Which should I do? So people usually say, you got to pull the lever. Save the 6, kill the 1. So then classically, the way the philosophers go, the next question is, okay, fine. If so, imagine you're on a bridge, and not at a fork, but on a bridge. And while you're standing on the bridge, you see on down track, again, the family of 6. Now you see the train barely down the track. It's just one train, one car, but it's big enough, it's going to kill those 6. Happens to be, and this is just the way the ethicists, the philosophers build the scenario, there's a morbidly obese person, 800-pound person sitting on the bridge next to you, just eating popcorn, watching the train go down the tracks. And you realize, if I push him over, he's right over the track. He'll land on the track, block the train, and save the 6. But now you're not just diverting the train, you're literally pushing him off a bridge. That's a little harder to justify. So this is a big debate in philosophers. And fascinatingly, it comes up in halacha as well. And it's being debated today in Israel over how to design self-driving cars. Because Intel was bought out this Israeli company where the CEO lives in Efrat, is an Orthodox Jew, and is asking rabbis questions about how to design the ethics of the cars. So the source is, there is a Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish, in his commentary in the Talmud, in a couple places actually, he comments on a similar scenario that comes up in the Talmud. And he actually, my understanding is the case happened in Bnei Brak, in Israel. The case that happened there was a truck. This used to happen a lot back in the day. A truck's driving down the road and its brakes went out. The driver's pushing the brakes and it's not slowing down. It's a one-way road and there's a little Volkswagen Bug in front of it with a full family. This truck's going to just smash that Bug. The driver realizes, I can't do anything. I'm just going to hit the car. He realizes maybe I could divert off to the sidewalk. And then he realizes, there's one person on the sidewalk. So do I just do nothing, smash into the car, or do I turn and kill that one person? So we asked the Chazon Ish after the fact. Obviously couldn't ask at the time. Now he survived the crash. But the Chazon Ish argued, yes, this is in the Talmud. The Talmud has a case where with an archer, an expert shooter, hates, someone's shooting an arrow. And he's such a good shooter, just so you have to imagine the case. He's such a good shot that he's able to kill 6 people in one shot. They're lined up, he'll get all 6 of them. You happen to be laying, in between the archer and the people, and you have a shield, but you only have enough time to divert the arrow. You're not going to be able to block it. And you realize as you're going towards the arrow, if you divert it, it's going to get another person, an innocent bystander. Do you kill the one? So the Chazon Ish argues, some disagreed, but the Chazon Ish has become the accepted opinion. The Chazon Ish argues that it's true, we never kill one person. You can't even, if marauders would come and say, give us one person to kill or we kill the whole community, you have to do nothing. You have to be passive, sheva al taseh, don't give up one person to die, everyone's going to die. But he says in this case, it's not considered that your act with the shield is killing one. It's not what he calls in Hebrew a maisa hariga. It's not an act of killing. It's a maisa hatzala. It's an act of saving. You're saving the 6. Unfortunately, your act of saving the 6 leads to one death. But you're allowed to do that in order to save a life. You're saving 6 lives because we have a principle in halacha of hatzalat harabim. Always in halacha, the many come before the one, the few. And so the Chazon Ish argued, Tzitz Eliezer and a couple others disagreed, but Chazon Ish argued, Rav Asher Weiss agrees, and that we do divert to killing the one because we're not killing the one, we're saving the 6. And that's the justification in halacha for what we call population health. In halacha, we would call it hatzalas harabim. But this leads to a very interesting dilemma. What about all things being equal? Can you ever differentiate between people? Are there ever people who are more important than other people? Right? When we say it's 6 versus 1, okay, what if it's 1 versus 1? Would you ever say, well, it depends on who that one is? Could we ever say such a thing? So I want to show you a fascinating document that came out of Israel during the early parts of the pandemic, and the sources for it, and then what we do with that. So I'm gonna have to scroll down. Sorry, I'm gonna go back a little bit, but this leads to a few interesting topics. Okay, here it is. You can all see this where it says position paper? Yes, good. Okay, so what this was the state of Israel's official triage decision-making paradigm for for ventilators. This committee was chaired by Rabbi Dr. Avram Steinberg, who is really the world's leading bioethicist. He's a rabbi. He's an Orthodox rabbi. He's a pediatric neurologist. And the secular state of Israel turned to him, as well as a whole committee, to create these guidelines. And they're fascinating. Look at what he says. And this is all based on halacha, as I'll show you. So he writes, see here, it says number 10. The triage decisions will only take place on a medical basis as described above, right? Only medical decisions. Therefore, meaning medical decisions was who needs it more. Therefore, the following factors will not be included in the triage decisions: religion, race, gender, nationality, country of origin. This included in Israel, Syrian refugees, Palestinians. Everyone needs to be treated equally. Sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, social status, family status, citizenship, occupation. Everyone has to get equal treatment. Years of life, we're going to come back to this in a minute, including age considerations. The chronological age itself is not a legitimate consideration in triaging life-saving treatment, but only as part of a combination of risk factors. Disability in itself is not a legitimate consideration in triaging life-saving treatment, but only as part of a combination of risk factors. Another one, circumstances that may be considered to be the patient's own fault, including negligence, which may have caused a COVID-19 infection. What if the patient comes into the emergency room with COVID-19 and they have a t-shirt on that says, COVID is a hoax, don't wear a mask? Do you still treat them? Yeah, you do. a doctor here, I was talking about this with a doctor here, and she told me that she wants actually in our emergency room here, we're a Jewish hospital, they ripped open a patient's shirt to do CPR, and he had a huge swastika on his chest tattooed. And for a second, she paused, like, do I really, save his life? And then right away, she's like, no, of course, this is my job. I'm a doctor. I save his life. And she actually said that she did save his life. He recovered. And she, before he was being discharged, she was in his room checking up on him. And he said to her at one point, she has a very Jewish name. He said to her, doctor, I need to talk to you about something. I know you saw my chest. And she says, I wasn't going to say anything. So he says, I just want you to know that I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed of myself, and I apologize. And thank you for caring for me the way you did. And then she said, of course, we care for everybody. And that was it, but just really moving story. Anyways, it doesn't, even if they're negligent, it doesn't matter. Everyone gets cared for equally. Also merits to the patient from their past actions to this time, equal. But then look what happens here, number 11. This is fascinating. What happened here? Healthcare professionals, even if infected while treating COVID-19 patients, will not be given priority unless it is necessary to overcome staff shortages, either by facilitating return to work after their recovery or as an incentive to volunteering. When there's medical equality between two patients, healthcare professionals will receive priority. So the state of Israel, when it came to ventilators, the state of Israel said, if all else being equal, everything else is equal, we will prioritize healthcare providers. They're putting themselves at risk. We need them back on the front lines. We need them to be willing to volunteer, and therefore we're going to prioritize them. So because we debated this at our hospital in our ethics committee, and we ended up deciding not to prioritize healthcare providers. I actually thought we should, to be honest. I lost the vote in our committee. UCLA down the road did include healthcare providers. Okay, different hospitals took different approaches. So I asked Dr. Steinberg, what was that based on? Because I know him, and I know that whatever they decided, he will have a source in the Talmud for it. And he did. And he said to me, and I'll show it to you right now. He said to me, check out the Gemara in Horios, right here, 13b. There's a debate. Who do you say first when it comes to the type of Kohen Gadol? There's a Skan Kohen Gadol and a Kohen Meshuach Melchama. The Skan Kohen Gadol is the Kohen Gadol whose job it is to be prepared in case the full Kohen Gadol becomes tameh, becomes impure. Then you need a backup to go into the Kodesh HaKodashim. The Kohen Meshuach Melchama had a different job. His job was to go out to battle and inspire the troops and be with the people. So the Talmud here at first says, when it comes to being contaminated, you have to prioritize the Meshuach Melchama. It's okay if it becomes contaminated. But what about to save their life? La'achioso, I'll just go to the last line here. He says, V'atanya, Meshuach Melchama, Kodem L'skan. The Meshuach Melchama comes first. Why? La'achioso, to save his life. Rashi says the reason is, Hu Kodem L'skan, Mishum, the Tzibur Tzrichim Lo. The community needs him. There's such category as Tzibur Tzrichim Lo, or sometimes they call it Rabbim Tzrichim Lo. If someone's needed by the masses, there might be ability to justify prioritizing them. And since there's an instrumental value, you need healthcare providers. If the healthcare system breaks down and you simply don't have doctors and nurses, the whole society, not just from COVID, there will be mass death and tragedy. So since it's such a societal need, he argued that in Israel, they became very strict. We have to be careful about this, though. There's a slippery slope, because then you're going to start saying, well, what about politicians? What about CEOs and administrators of hospitals? What about rabbis? And it becomes a real big slippery slope. Teachers, you could really argue teachers, and that's actually, I think, easy to argue. The teachers are needed by society, but it's a challenge. But this is an important area of debate. And I think it's clear that from a halachic approach, there is room to say, well, we have to treat everyone equally, but we can try to sometimes figure out, it's very hard to figure out, and we have to be extremely careful about it. But sometimes there's a communal need that might give someone or some group of people precedence. And we're a little bit seeing that with the vaccine distribution. That there is sometimes talk about, healthcare providers or teachers, that maybe there's room for prioritization. This leads to one more. I'll just bring up one more. There's a few more that I could talk about, but I'll just bring up one more for now. See what you want to talk about. And if not, there's a few more I'll share. I could go for hours, but so one more that's just very related to this, which is age. Should age be something you take into account when it comes to, from the secular approach? In fact, I'll show that first. I'm sorry. Here, there's something called sales. I don't know if you ever heard of this. Sales is standard expected years of life lost. Sometimes they call this the fair innings approach. And some bioethicists argue that younger people should receive priority because they have more life left to live. And therefore, people who are older, they've already lived a full life. Let them go, let them give their spot for younger people. Now, from a halachic perspective, I think this is offensive. I think the poskim disagree strongly. This is not accepted by the rabbis. That, first of all, you never know how long someone has to live, right? We don't know. We know, only God knows how long people have to live. We don't, just averages is not enough. And also, we believe that all life, the Talmud says in a few places, David, the king of Israel, is the same value. His life is the same as a newborn baby. They're all humans. They're all in the image of God, and we have to treat everyone with equal dignity. Doesn't matter. Even the Mishnah Berurah writes in one place of whether their mental capacity, whatever. Every human being is equal. But this is an interesting approach. But what there is room for in halacha, which is an interesting debate, and this has come up lately in a few places, is where is it? That there could, this is it. Even though we don't prioritize by age, we don't say a 25-year-old person is more important than a 95-year-old person. They're equal value. But what if a person is terminal and is dying? There is such a category in halacha as chaye shah and chaye olam. Chaye shah means terminal. We know this from the Haftorah Metzora. The Haftorah, the story of the Arba Mitzorayim. You know the story? There's 4 Mitzorayim, the Tsaras, right? They have the leprosy, whatever, disease. And so they're forced to live in isolation, in quarantine, which we know all about now, right? So they live out outside the city, and they're starving. They think they're going to die from starvation. And they see that there is a field, a Midianite field off in the distance, an encampment. And they realize if we go in there, we could get some food and we could live. But there's a high likelihood they're going to kill us if we go in there. They don't want to see us there. So they debate, should we go in and risk our lives to get food? And they decide, you know what, if we don't get the food, we're going to die for sure. If we do get the food, probably we'll die, but maybe we won't. So since we're going to die anyways, we're allowed to take that risk. Let's go. They go, and then they get lucky. A miracle happens. The city is abandoned, and they're able to eat the food, and they survive. But we learn from this that there's a concept the Gemara says, the Talmud says, l'chaye shah lo chayshinan. We're allowed to take certain risks for a life that's dying. We treat them with equal dignity and value. We even say a gosei says, harehu kachay l'chol davar. Even someone who's in the dying process, literally that day, is treated like they're alive. But when it comes to triaging, someone who has a full lifespan, however long that is, meaning they could be 95 years old, but they're not dying. Someone who is has a terminal, incurable, progressive terminal illness, that we do give priority to the person who does not have the terminal illness. So there is that distinction, which is just interesting, and does give some room for debate. And I'll just end with one last piece that's just based on that, which is you might have seen on the sheet there, right there. Moshe Feinstein was asked when it came to triage. The story was Rabbi Moshe David Tendler Shlita. He was he's the son-in-law of Rav Moshe. He once came to visit his father-in-law. I think it was Erev Rosh Hashanah, and while they're there, the phone rang, and he picked up the phone, and it was I think it was Rav Herzog, the chief rabbi of Israel. He had a question for Rav Moshe. The question was, they had just received in Shaare Zedek 9 doses of penicillin, but they had 31 patients who needed it. So he asked Rav Moshe, which 9 should we give it to? So he said, Rav Moshe responded, first come, first serve. First ones who ask, first ones you encounter, that's who gets it first. Now, many poskim disagreed with this. Recently, Rav Asher Weiss, during the pandemic, wrote that he disagrees with it. Many people have found this to not be ethically justifiable. Many bioethicists write, it's not fair because people who live closer to a hospital get priority. It might also lead to violence, people fighting over their spot. There's a lot of concerns. But it's interesting. I'm just throwing it out there because we are learning from the distribution kind of struggles that the United States is having right now. Look how well it went in Israel, how well it's going in Israel. It's really a Kiddush Hashem. What's going wrong in the United States? Some have argued, I'm not saying that necessarily I take this approach, but it's just worthy to just throw it out there for discussion. Some have argued that we might have overthought it in the United States. we might have overthought the triage and tried to worry too much about who should come first, who should come 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, and people are fighting and people are showing up and being turned away. People are not coming because maybe we should have been a little bit more like open with it, and maybe there's a value to the first come first serve. That's just what some people are debating right now, so I just throw it out there. Lottery systems, things like that. Maybe not using all of these categories that I've brought up, but maybe there's other methodologies that Ramosha mentioned that sometimes sound ridiculous, but then upon further reflection have a lot of wisdom as well. And so I just throw it out there. So there's a lot more to say, but I just feel like I'm talking so much. I'd love to hear any reactions, comments, questions, your experiences.
So, Yasher Koach, Rabbi Weiner. I was thinking when you brought up Harayot, I was actually thinking of the last two Mishnayot in Harayot. I can't say I'm familiar with the Gemara, but the end of the Mishnah gives a bunch of different categories of how to prioritize saving different people's lives. And I was thinking about that, and what I'm just curious, how do modern poskim look at these Mishnayot and whatever Gemaras are associated with them versus what was the triage that you were talking about?
Yeah, there has been a tradition amongst the poskim. Rav Moshe writes this, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach writes this, and others, not to utilize that Mishnah Horyo, which says, you should say first a Kohen, then a Levi, things like that, and prioritize that way, because they felt like that's not really prioritizing for life saving. Rav Moshe also writes, that was when you have all those being equal, you have no way of determining kind of, the amount of mitzvot a person has done. So you give them that priority. But nowadays we have no way of determining. We don't know who is holier. We can't make those decisions. And also, as Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, blessed memory, wrote, and I thought it's very compelling, that Mishnah, if you look at the end of it, it first lists all the priorities, but then at the end it says, but what if, it says like a Talmud Chacham, a Torah scholar becomes before a mamzer. But then it says, but a mamzer who's a Talmud Chacham comes before a Kohen Gadol who's an Am Haaretz. Like it turns the whole thing on its head. And Rav looks and says, you see from that it's actually the whole thing. Even the Mishnah itself was saying the truth is we don't really follow necessarily it's only like all else being equal. We have no other way of making decisions. So this is a suggested principle list, but actually we don't really. It's not really meant to be followed in these triage determinations. And so the tradition amongst the rabbis has not been to utilize that Mishnah. But I've seen many quote this Gemara and Horius that I mentioned, that Rashi. It's a good question.
Any other questions? I have a question for Weiner, but I want other people to go before
I see,
me.
Dror,
yeah.
Yeah, so a question. You mentioned what's happening in Eretz Israel as a Kiddush Hashem as far as the vaccination, which I agree with fully, but I want to kind of raise the opposite side of that, which has been troubling me a great deal over the course of the past year. And I can only ask it of somebody who is, on the one hand, a Rav and steeped in halacha, but on the other hand, understands what this pandemic is firsthand. We've seen so many examples over the past year of the very frum community not complying with public health guidelines, both in the United States and in Eretz Israel. I've been embarrassed so many times by scenes from Brooklyn or from Yerushalayim. How is it that in our community where we value life so much, every life so much, as you pointed out, how is it that in the very frum community, we've seen repeated examples of communities not complying with guidelines, and the leaders in those communities, the Gedolim, not taking a stronger stand and saying we have to follow these rules? It's really something that's been deeply troubling to me throughout the course of these many months. Any explanation for how that's been going?
I'll simply share, and I would also defer to your rabbi. This is a very difficult question. I've struggled with it as well. I've been very, I think about it a lot, and I'm suffering with it. I'm hurt by it, but I will just point out a couple of things. First of all, I think it's important to remember that as much as there are some parts of the broader community that have been very disappointing this past year, there's also lots of parts of our community that have been very inspiring, and we can't forget that there's a lot. If you just look in, in the YU, RCA, Rav Hershel Schachter, Rav Mordechai Willig, Rav Usher Weiss, the great leaders that we have been incredible in how responsible that they have been and what great leaders they've been. So on the one hand, we have a lot to be proud of. There's been a lot of people that have done the right thing. I heard Rav Hershel Schachter say recently, he said, Rav Akiva Eger in the cholera pandemic, he was so strict, he was so careful, more than the government guidelines, that the government, the Lithuanian government actually gave him an award after the pandemic because they were so impressed by how the Jewish community responded. And Rav Schachter was lamenting, like, is that going to happen after this pandemic? I'm not so sure that we're going to get an award for our behavior. And Rav Usher Weiss, I asked him the question. He said to me, it's beyond me. I don't get it. It is, I think, not as widespread as we sometimes get the impression from the media. It sometimes gets blown out of proportion. So I'm comforted by knowing that many of our great rabbinic leaders are doing the right thing. And so we can be proud of that. I will say, if there was anything, just one point to just try to at least have a limud zchus, try to judge favorably, as much as I also really disagree and I've just been disappointed and frustrated. There is one of the most important things we have in the Torah, is the commandment to guard your health, as you pointed out. In fact, it's the only commandment that actually uses the word meod very much. V'nishmartem meod l'nafshotechem. In the other place, it's repeated twice. It says, Rak hishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha meod, guard your life, pen tishkach es hadavar asher ro'eh einecha, lest you forget what you have seen. So some of the commentaries on that point out, it's saying, guard your health, but then it gives a reason. It says, so that you can study Torah, so that you can have a meaningful life. And I can see an argument. I'm not justifying people's behavior, disregarding government, requirements, protesting in the streets, trashing police cars. I'm not justifying, behavior that, really mostly like, teenagers who are doing this. I don't think it's community leaders justifying it either. But I could see understand a perspective that says, like, our most important thing in our life is our values, is the Torah, is living our values. And I do appreciate that many of the Jewish schools have found ways. Are there ways we could keep the schools functioning? Are there ways we can worry about the kids? It's been so much suffering, shutting down schools and businesses. And is there a way to find a middle approach where we can still live our values? And for some Haredim, it's an extreme, but it's really hard to find this nuance. And their whole lifestyle is challenged by the pandemic. Their whole lifestyle involves gathering. That's their lifestyle. And to not live their lifestyle is such a sacrifice. And I can only hope that there will be some cheshbon nefesh after. There's a certain mistrust of the government that's generational trauma. So some things the government says, and they can't. Rabbi Tursky from YU, Rabbi Tursky, I heard him say, I thought it was profound. He said, we believe, kind of in like the YU community, we believe that you can take we benefit from learning from the outside world, right? There's certain things we don't want to benefit from, but we benefit by exposure. But there's certain parts of the Orthodox community that believe that all influence on the outside world is bad. Unfortunately, even the good things, which are like basic health and science requirements, unfortunately get filtered out. And hopefully there will be a cheshbon nefesh at a certain point where they realize, maybe there are certain things that are in our own best interest. And if this ever happens again, we need to maybe reconsider some of our behavior. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I commiserate with you.
You gave two examples before. One of them was if someone's an archer is shooting something and you have a shield and you can save 6 people, but it's going to deflect it and kill another person, you can do that because it's Hatzalah. And then you gave the other example of if they say, give us one person or we're going to kill the whole town, you can't give them the one person. But why isn't that considered Hatzalah also? Because you're saving the whole town except for the one person.
Yeah, but the Gemara feels that you're taking a person who's not currently in danger, and you're like pushing them into danger. That Gemara does though say that if it would be a case of like Shiva ben Bichri, who was someone who was guilty of capital punishment for rebelling against King David, who went and hid in a town, and they were going to go wipe out the whole town unless he would reveal himself. So in that case, the Gemara says, so he revealed that they turned him over. So the Gemara says that would be justifiable because he's the one who deserves the punishment, and we're all going to die because of him. So giving him over as saving us. But in the other case, the rabbis felt that that's actually forcing someone who wasn't otherwise at danger, even though you could argue, yes. And that's why it's a machlokas, that Gemara, by the way.
Well, the whole town is in danger, though.
Yes,
Everybody.
exactly. That's why it's a machlokas, but
Yeah.
that's the conclusion of that Gemara. I hear your question. It's a good question, but that's not that's this.
We're almost at 9. Maybe one last question or comment. I don't want to ask anything. Maybe ask about Rabbi Weiner's hospital life responsibilities in general.
I had a second question, but Rabbi.
Sure,
you said you
William,
had a
please,
question
yeah.
too. Okay, so you mentioned, Rabbi Weiner, about that in this case, the medical ethics corresponded with halachic medical ethics. Do you see going forward that halakha might have a bigger influence somehow on medical ethics? And part of the reason I'm framing this question, I'll try to be brief. This was a long time ago, but my grandmother, who at the time was a chayesha, was on a ventilator, and the so-called bioethicists tried to convince my mother and her siblings to pull the plug, and my mother, who's a nurse, said, not a chance, and was accused by the bioethicist of being unethical. And of course, it was from our perspective, from halakha's perspective, it's the bioethicist who is being unethical. So do you think that there could be some use of COVID to try to maybe raise the level of bioethics?
Well, I will say this, the role of ethics and like values in decision-making in hospitals has become more prominent because there's so many value-based decisions that have had to be made in this past year. And you see that, bioethicists have been very involved, clergy have been very involved. And so I think because of the higher prominence and higher utilization, that's hopeful to me, right? Getting a seat at the table is the first step. So yeah, I think so.
Okay, great. Thank you very, very much, Rabbi Weiner. If I don't want to put you in the spot, but if people have further questions for Rabbi Weiner, I hope it was okay if I share ways for people to get in touch with you.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, great. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. And it's great seeing everyone. Everyone should have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Rabbi Weiner. Yasher koach. Good night, everyone.
Nice to meet you all. Stay well, stay healthy, stay warm.
Thank
Come
you.
visit.
Thank you.
Thank you.